A Nobel laureate in the hot seat. Alright, so picture this. You've got this guy, Professor Muhammad Yunus. He's not your average politician, not by a long shot. This man is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Yeah, you heard that right. He got it back in 2006 for pioneering microcredit and microfinance. Basically, he came up with this brilliant idea of giving small loans to super poor people, especially women, so they could start their own businesses. Think of it as a financial leg up for those who really need it. His Grameen Bank became a global model, showing the world that even a tiny bit of capital can make a massive difference in people's lives. He was a rock star in the development world, a symbol of hope and innovation. Now, being a Nobel laureate usually means you get to give inspiring speeches, attend fancy dinners, and maybe advise governments from a comfortable distance. You don't typically find yourself smack dab in the middle of a political hurricane, but life, as they say, has a funny way of throwing curveballs, especially in a place as dynamic and, let's be honest, sometimes chaotic as Bangladesh. Professor Yunus, the banker to the poor, suddenly found himself in a role he probably never auditioned for, leading an entire country during a super tricky transition. It's like your favorite economics professor suddenly becoming the school principal during a massive food fight. Good luck, Prof! His journey from the world of microfinance to the corridors of power is a story in itself, one that speaks volumes about the political climate in Bangladesh. Before all this recent drama, he was seen as this almost saintly figure above the fray of partisan politics. His focus was poverty alleviation, empowering the marginalized. He was the guy everyone could agree was doing good work. This reputation for integrity and neutrality is precisely why, when things went sideways in Bangladesh, many eyes turned to him. They needed someone credible, someone who wasn't deeply entrenched in the old political battles to steer the ship. So when we talk about Professor Yunus, we're talking about a man who built his career on empowering the grassroots, on believing in the potential of individuals. Now, he's tasked with empowering an entire nation to find its footing after a major political upheaval. The skills are kind of transferable, right? Maybe. Dealing with desperate entrepreneurs is one thing. Dealing with desperate political factions and a restless military is a whole different ballgame. It's a massive shift, from lending out small sums to managing a national budget, from inspiring social change to navigating political minefields. The stakes are incredibly high, not just for him but for all of Bangladesh. So how did our Nobel Prize-winning economist become the main man in Bangladesh? Well, it wasn't through a typical election campaign, that's for sure. This whole thing kicked off in August 2024. There was this massive student-led uprising. Think of it like a youthquake, a huge wave of young people who were just fed up. They were protesting against the government of then Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. The students had a long list of grievances and things got pretty intense. The protests grew and eventually Sheikh Hasina, who had been in power for a long time, had to step down. She actually fled the country and went to India. Talk about a dramatic exit. With Hasina gone, there was a giant power vacuum. Who was going to step in? The country needed an interim leader, someone to hold things together until new elections could be organized, and crucially, some serious reforms could be made. This is where Professor Yunus enters the political stage, almost like a surprise guest star. Given his international reputation, his Nobel Prize, and the general feeling that he was untainted by the bitter partisan politics that had plagued Bangladesh for years, he seemed like a pretty good choice to many. He was seen as a beacon of hope, a steady hand to guide the nation through these turbulent waters. His appointment as chief advisor of the interim government was largely welcomed, both at home and abroad. People thought, okay, this guy knows how to build things, he knows how to help people, maybe he can fix this. It was a moment of cautious optimism. The students who led the uprising and many ordinary citizens were looking for a fresh start, a break from the old political dynasties and their often acrimonious battles. Professor Yunus, with his focus on social justice and economic empowerment, seemed to embody that hope for a new beginning. He wasn't a career politician, and that was a big part of his appeal, but taking the helm of a country in crisis is no walk in the park, even for a Nobel laureate. The interim government, led by Yunus, was tasked with a monumental job, not just organizing elections, but also implementing deep-rooted reforms that the protesters had demanded. These reforms were aimed at things like ensuring accountability, tackling corruption, and preventing the kind of authoritarian practices that many felt had taken hold under the previous administration. So, Professor Yunus stepped into this incredibly complex situation, armed with his reputation and a whole lot of goodwill but facing a mountain of challenges. It was a shift from microloans to macro governance, and the learning curve was steep. Now imagine Professor Yunus trying to get everyone in Bangladesh to agree on, well, anything. It's like trying to host a dinner party where everyone has different dietary restrictions, and they all hate each other's favorite foods. He's reportedly struggling to govern because there's this massive political deadlock. On one side, you have the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, or BNP. These guys are a major political force, and they're not happy just sitting on the sidelines. They're basically saying, okay, new guy, that's great, but we need elections like yesterday, and definitely by December 2025. They've even threatened to pull their support if an election timeline isn't set soon. Then you have the student-led movements. Remember those students who ousted the last prime minister? Well, they didn't just go home. They formed a new political outfit, the National Citizen Party, NCP. And their big thing is, hold your horses on the elections. We need systemic reforms before we vote again. They argue that if you just rush into elections without fixing the underlying problems, you'll end up with the same old mess. And it seems the interim government with Yunus at the helm kind of agrees with the NCP's stance. They want to clean house a bit before inviting new tenants, if you know what I mean. And it doesn't stop there. You've also got other groups like the Bangladesh Jamaat-e-Islami, BJI, who are also supporting the idea of reforms before elections. They want to ensure accountability and prevent any return to what they see as authoritarian practices. So Professor Yunus is in the middle, trying to balance these very different, very loud demands. He's even set to meet with leaders from the BNP and Jamaat-e-Islami, probably to try and find some common ground, or at least to stop them from shouting at each other quite so loudly. It's a delicate dance, trying to keep everyone somewhat on board while pushing a reform agenda. The pressure is immense. Yunus has reportedly expressed frustration over this lack of political consensus and cooperation. Sources say he feels held hostage by all the protests and the political gridlock. It's like he's trying to drive a car, but everyone in the passenger seat is grabbing the steering wheel and yelling different directions. He apparently feels cornered, with resistance coming from all sides. This isn't exactly the smooth transition anyone was hoping for. It's more like a political wrestling match, and Professor Yunus is the reluctant referee who might also be getting thrown around the ring a bit. Okay, so we've got the politicians and the student groups all making noise, but there's another major player in Bangladesh that you absolutely cannot ignore: the military. And let me tell you, they've got opinions, and they're not shy about sharing them. The military actually played a key role in Professor Yunus's rise to power in the first place. When things got really unstable after Sheikh Hasina's ouster, the army stepped in to maintain order. They've been deployed since July 2024 because civilian law enforcement kind of collapsed. So they're a big deal, and their support is crucial. Now here's where it gets tricky. The military, particularly the army chief, General Waker Uzzaman, isn't entirely thrilled with some of Yunus's policies or his administration's timeline. The general is pushing for national elections by December 2025. That's a direct clash with Yunus's team, who would prefer to hold elections in mid-2026. Why the delay? Yunus's side says they need more time for those all-important reforms we talked about, but the army chief seems to think, let's get this election show on the road sooner rather than later. This difference in opinion is a major source of tension. The disagreements don't stop at election timing. General Waker Uzzaman has also reportedly opposed some specific government initiatives. For instance, there was a plan for a humanitarian corridor into Myanmar's Rakhine state. The army chief apparently said, nope, an elected government should make that call, not an interim one. He also wasn't keen on foreign management of the Chattogram port. These aren't small disagreements, they touch on national sovereignty and major policy decisions. It shows that the military is keeping a very close watch and isn't afraid to push back if they don't like the direction things are heading. This creates a really delicate situation for Professor Yunus. He needs the military support to maintain stability, especially with civilian law enforcement still finding its feet. But he also needs to assert the authority of the interim civilian government. The army is taking a stricter stance on law and order, which is good in some ways, as they're opposing mob violence and organized chaos. But it also means they're a powerful force that the interim government has to constantly negotiate with. There was even a meeting on May 20th, 2025, between Yunus and the military chiefs amidst all these intensifying power struggles. You can bet that was a very interesting conversation. Section 5. Whispers and worries. Is Professor Yunus packing his bags? So, with all this pressure cooker atmosphere, the political squabbling, the military disagreements, it's no surprise that rumors started flying. Reports began to surface, including from big names like BBC Bangla, that Professor Yunus was feeling the heat. Apparently, during one cabinet meeting he expressed deep frustration and even said he intended to resign. Can you imagine the scene? The Nobel laureate, the man brought in to save the day, basically saying, "I'm out." That's a pretty big deal. It signals that things are incredibly tough behind the scenes, perhaps even more than we realize from the outside. Now, according to these initial reports, his advisors managed to persuade him to stay. They probably gave him the whole "don't go, the country needs you" speech, and maybe a cup of tea. But the fact that the thought even crossed his mind, and was reportedly voiced, shows the extent of the strain he's under. He's trying to push an ambitious reform agenda, like splitting the National Board of Revenue, but he's facing resistance not just from outside political groups, but also from within the government itself. It's like trying to renovate a house while the residents are still living in it and arguing about the paint color. Later, after an unscheduled advisory council meeting, officials came out and said, "Nope, Professor Yunus is not resigning, he's not leaving the country." Advisors like Wahiduddin Mahmood stated that Yunus hadn't expressed any intention to step down during meeting. But the earlier reports had already set the alarm bells ringing. It painted a picture of a leader feeling cornered and isolated, struggling to make headway against a tide of conflicting demands and entrenched interests. He reportedly feels like he's being held hostage by the political gridlock, unable to move forward with the reforms that he and the student movements believe are so crucial for Bangladesh's future. The advisory council did acknowledge the difficulties, though. They talked about disruptions caused by unreasonable demands and extrajudicial statements, which sounds like diplomatic speak for people are being really difficult and saying crazy things. They emphasized the need for unity to maintain stability and prevent the country from sliding back into dictatorship. They even mentioned foreign conspiracies, which always adds a nice dramatic flair. But underneath it all, the message was clear. Professor Yunus is facing a monumental challenge, and the thought of stepping down, whether seriously contemplated or just a moment of intense frustration, highlights just how precarious the situation is. Section 6. The What-If Game: Bangladesh without Yunus at the helm. Let's play the what-if game for a moment. What if Professor Yunus actually did decide, you know what, this is too much. I'm going back to microfinance, and tendered his resignation. What would that mean for Bangladesh? Well, to put it mildly, it could plunge the country into even deeper uncertainty. Right now, he's one of the few figures who commands at least a baseline level of respect across different factions, even if they disagree with his methods or timeline. His departure would leave a massive leadership void, and finding a replacement acceptable to everyone would be like finding a unicorn that also does your taxes. Think about the immediate aftermath. The political factions, already at loggerheads, might see his resignation as an opportunity to seize more power, or push their agendas even more aggressively. The BNP would likely clamor louder for immediate elections, fearing that any further delay without a strong neutral figure like Yunus would be detrimental. The student-led NCP, on the other hand, might feel betrayed, seeing their champion of reform step down before the job is done. This could lead to more protests, more instability, and a general sense that the progress made since Sheikh Hasina's ouster is unraveling fast. And what about the military? Their role would become even more critical, and potentially more dominant. If the civilian interim government collapses or loses its figurehead, the army might feel compelled to step in more forcefully to maintain order. This could lead Bangladesh down a path that many, especially those who protested for democratic reforms, would be deeply uncomfortable with. The entire transition process, aimed at establishing a more stable and accountable democratic system, could be derailed. The hope that Yunus represented, the promise of a carefully managed reform period followed by fair elections, would be seriously jeopardized. Moreover, a resignation by Yunus would send a terrible signal to the international community. He's a globally recognized figure. His leadership lent a certain legitimacy and credibility to the interim government. If he steps down because the political infighting and institutional resistance make it impossible for him to govern, it would suggest that Bangladesh's problems are even more intractable than previously thought. This could affect foreign aid, investment, and diplomatic relations. In short, his resignation wouldn't just be a political hiccup. It could trigger a cascade of negative consequences, potentially leading to a prolonged period of instability and political crisis. Section 7. Voices on the ground. What are people actually saying? It's not just Professor Yunus feeling the heat. Everyone involved has something to say, and their words paint a picture of a deeply divided landscape. Take Amir Khosrow Mahmood Chowdhury, a leader from the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, BNP. His message is pretty clear. We need elections, and we need a proper caretaker government to oversee them. For the BNP, the priority is a swift return to an elected government, presumably one they hope to lead. They see the interim period as just that, interim, and want it to be as short as possible. Their focus is less on deep systemic reforms before polls and more on the polls themselves. Then you have the student leaders like Sarwar Tushar, a joint convener of the National Citizen Party, NCP. He's calling for something different. He talks about the need for unity and a national agenda to resolve the crisis. This reflects the NCP's stance that you can't just paper over the cracks with a quick election. They believe fundamental changes are needed to ensure that whatever government comes next doesn't repeat the mistakes of the past. Their vision is longer term, focused on building a more robust and accountable system. They are the ones championing the reforms first mantra, which aligns with what Professor Yunus's administration has been trying to achieve. Inside Yunus's own team, his advisors are trying to project an image of stability while acknowledging the challenges. After those resignation rumors, planning advisor Wahiduddin Mahmood was quick to state that Yunus hadn't expressed any intention to step down during a recent key meeting. Another key advisor, Syeda Rizwana Hassan, a prominent environmental lawyer, emphasized that the interim government's mission is broader than just holding elections. She said their job includes reform, justice, and elections. This highlights the interim government's commitment to a more comprehensive overhaul, not just a quick electoral fix, which puts them at odds with groups like the BNP. And of course, there's the powerful voice of the Army Chief, General Waker-uz-Zaman. He's not just talking about election timelines, advocating for polls by December 2025. He's also weighing in on specific policy issues like opposing the humanitarian corridor into Myanmar or foreign management of a key port. His statements carry significant weight, signaling the military's active interest and influence in the country's governance. These diverse voices, from political old guards to new student activists, from government insiders to the military leadership, all contribute to the complex and often contradictory pressures that Professor Yunus is trying to navigate. Section 8. Reforms first or polls now? The Great Bangladeshi Debate. At the heart of this whole political drama in Bangladesh is one fundamental question. What comes first, the chicken or the egg, or in this case, reforms or elections? It's a debate that has basically split the country's political actors into two main camps, and Professor Yunus is caught right in the middle of it. On one side you have powerful groups like the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, BNP, who are adamant that elections need to happen quickly. Their argument is that an interim government, by its very nature, lacks the full mandate of an elected one, and therefore the country needs to return to electoral democracy as soon as possible, ideally by December 2025. This election's first camp often worries that a prolonged interim period, even one dedicated to reforms, could become a new form of unelected rule or could be manipulated by certain interests. They believe that an elected government, whatever its flaws, is the only legitimate body to undertake significant national decisions and long-term planning. They might also feel that delaying elections plays into the hands of those who want to keep established political parties like themselves out of power for longer. The pressure they're exerting for a clear and imminent election timeline is immense, and it's a constant headache for Professor Yunus's administration. On the other side of the ring are the student-led movements now organized under the National Citizen Party, NCP, and groups like Bangladesh Jamaat-e-Islami. Their rallying cry is reforms first. They argue that the political system that led to Sheikh Hasina's ouster was fundamentally broken. They point to issues like corruption, a lack of accountability, and the erosion of democratic institutions. Simply holding elections without addressing these root causes, they contend, would be like putting a fresh coat of paint on a house with a rotten foundation. It might look good for a little while, but eventually, it's all going to come crashing down again. This reforms first camp, which Professor Yunus's interim government seems to lean towards, believes that time is needed to implement crucial changes. This could include things like strengthening the election commission, ensuring judicial independence, reforming the civil service, and putting in place robust anti-corruption measures. They see this interim period as a unique window of opportunity to fix the system before handing it over to a new set of elected officials. The challenge, of course, is that reforms can be a lengthy and contentious process, and there's no universal agreement on what exactly needs reforming or how long it should take, leading to the current impasse. Section 9. So, what now? Crystal ball time. Spoiler, it's cloudy. So, here we are. Professor Yunus, the Nobel guy, is trying to steer Bangladesh through a political maze that would make a minotaur dizzy. He's got the BNP breathing down his neck for quick elections. He's got the student activists demanding deep reforms before any vote. And then there's the military with General Waker Uzzaman basically saying nice reform plans, but let's pick up the pace on those elections, shall we? It's a classic case of too many cooks, and they all have different recipes for the national dish. The big question on everyone's mind is, can Yunus actually navigate this political minefield? Or is a potential resignation still on the cards? The coming weeks are absolutely crucial. If Professor Yunus and his team can somehow forge a consensus, or at least a working compromise on the timeline for reforms and elections, then maybe, just maybe, Bangladesh can move forward. But that's a big if. The divisions are deep, and the trust levels between the various factions are probably somewhere around zero. The interim government has emphasized that its mission includes reform, justice, elections, suggesting they're not willing to sacrifice deep changes for a quick poll. But how long can they hold out against the mounting pressure, especially if the military also wants a faster track to elections? If Professor Yunus does eventually decide that the pressure is too much and steps down, what happens then? Does Bangladesh spiral into deeper chaos? Do the political factions dig their heels in even further? Does the military take on an even more prominent role? These are not fun questions to think about, but they are very real possibilities. The hope was that Yunus, with his global stature and perceived neutrality, could be the bridge over these troubled waters. If that bridge collapses, everyone could end up getting very wet. It's a high-stakes game of political chess, and every move is critical. Ultimately, the future of Bangladesh hangs in the balance. Will the nation manage to implement the reforms that so many believe are necessary to build a more stable and democratic future? Or will the political infighting and pressure lead to a premature election that solves little or worse, a complete breakdown of the interim process? Professor Yunus has reportedly said he feels cornered. Can he find a way out of that corner that benefits the entire nation? Or is Bangladesh heading for another chapter of uncertainty? Honestly, your guess is as good as mine. Stay tuned, folks, because this drama is far from over.